Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 3 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The early spring air of March 2016 in St. Louis carried with it an unsettling quiet, the kind that settles over a city just before everything changes. In an apartment in the heart of Missouri, a young woman sat in bed surrounded by baby shower invitations, her hands carefully writing out names and addresses while her thoughts drifted to the life growing inside her. Jocelyn Peters, 30 years old and 7 months pregnant, was preparing to welcome her daughter into the world, a little girl she had already named Micah Lee. For Jocelyn, this pregnancy represented hope, a fresh beginning after previous heartbreak, and a fierce determination to embrace motherhood regardless of the complications that surrounded her relationship with the baby's father. What Jocelyn didn't know, as she sat there in the soft glow of her bedroom light, was that the man she loved had already decided she and their unborn child had to die. Cornelius Green presented himself as a pillar of the St. Louis educational community. As principal of Carly Middle School, he commanded respect, shaped young minds, and appeared to embody the values he preached to students and staff alike. But beneath this polished exterior existed a man living multiple lives, weaving an intricate web of lies that would eventually collapse with devastating consequences. Green was married, a fact he had carefully obscured from Jocelyn Peters, who worked as a beloved third-grade teacher at Horace Mann Elementary School. To Jocelyn, Cornelius was the man who promised her a future, someone she believed was in the process of divorcing his wife to build a life with her. She trusted him completely, even as he simultaneously maintained romantic relationships with several other women, each one believing they held a special place in his heart. The deception was calculated and cruel, a pattern of manipulation that allowed Green to control the narrative of his life while everyone around him remained unaware of the truth. When Jocelyn discovered she was pregnant in 2015, she was filled with both joy and trepidation. This wasn't her first pregnancy with Cornelius. She had faced previous complications, situations that had ended in loss, circumstances that later evidence would suggest were not entirely accidental, but influenced by Green's coercion. But this time was different. This time, Jocelyn made a decision that would seal her fate. She was keeping this baby, no matter what Cornelius wanted. For Green, Jocelyn's pregnancy represented an existential threat to the carefully constructed facade of his life. A child would expose his lies, unravel his marriage, and destroy the reputation he had built in the community. As the weeks progressed and Jocelyn's belly grew, Green's desperation intensified. He tried to convince her to terminate the pregnancy, but she refused. When persuasion failed, he allegedly attempted something far more sinister, poisoning the unborn child. But even that failed. The baby continued to grow, healthy and strong, and Jocelyn's resolve only strengthened. By early 2016, as Jocelyn entered her third trimester, Cornelius Green had arrived at a horrifying conclusion. The only way to preserve his secret life was through murder. In the shadows of this unfolding tragedy stood Philip Cutler, a man whose bond with Cornelius Green stretched back to their childhood. The two had maintained a close friendship over the years, a connection built on shared history and mutual understanding. But in February 2016, Green approached his old friend with a proposal that would transform their relationship into a criminal conspiracy. The plan was as methodical as it was cruel. Green would pay Cutler to travel from Oklahoma to St. Louis and murder Jocelyn Peters and her unborn child. To finance this contract killing, Green turned to the institution he was supposed to protect. He began stealing money from Carly Middle School, siphoning funds from a school fundraiser meant to benefit the students he claimed to serve. The irony was bitter and revealing. Green was willing to rob children to pay for the murder of his own child. On March 7th, Green carefully packaged $2,500 in cash and sent it via UPS to an address in Oklahoma where Cutler would receive it. The sum was shockingly small for such a heinous act, prompting later observers to question what kind of desperation or darkness would lead someone to accept money to kill a pregnant woman for such a paltry amount. But Cutler accepted the package, and with it, the agreement to end 2 lives. The timeline moved forward with chilling precision. On March 21st, Cutler traveled to St. Louis and stayed at Green's home. The 2 men, bound by childhood memories now twisted into something monstrous, finalized the details of their plot. Green provided Cutler with everything he would need: keys to a car, keys to Jocelyn's apartment, and the assurance that he would be far away when the murder took place. On March 22nd, Green boarded a train to Chicago, establishing an alibi that he believed would shield him from suspicion. While he sat hundreds of miles away, pretending normalcy, Cutler remained in St. Louis, preparing to execute the plan. March 24th, 2016, began like any other evening for Jocelyn Peters. At 31 weeks pregnant, her body carried the beautiful weight of impending motherhood. She had retreated to her bedroom, settling into bed with her baby shower invitations spread around her. Each card represented a friend, a family member, a colleague who would celebrate the arrival of little Micah Lee. Jocelyn worked carefully, her handwriting neat and deliberate, unaware that these invitations would never be sent, that the party they announced would never take place. Philip Cutler approached the apartment with the keys Green had given him, slipping inside with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew he didn't belong there. He found Jocelyn in her bedroom, vulnerable and unsuspecting, absorbed in her task. In his hand, he carried a small caliber firearm, and in a detail that would later become part of the case's grim legend, he had fashioned a makeshift silencer from a potato to muffle the sound of the gunshot. What happened next took only seconds, but would echo through countless lives for years to come. Cutler aimed the weapon at Jocelyn's head and fired. The young teacher, 7 months pregnant and full of dreams for her daughter's future, died instantly. With her, Micah Lee's life ended before it could truly begin. After confirming that Jocelyn was dead, Cutler called Cornelius Green to report that the job was done. Green, still in Chicago, received the news and immediately set his next plan in motion. He purchased a train ticket back to St. Louis, timing his return to create the appearance of innocence. When Cornelius Green returned to St. Louis, he slipped seamlessly into the role of grieving boyfriend, a performance designed to deflect suspicion and exploit the emotions of those who cared about Jocelyn. He went to Jocelyn's apartment, where her body still lay undiscovered, and then contacted her mother, Lacey Peters, with the devastating news. Lacey had liked Cornelius, had welcomed him as the man who made her daughter happy. She described him as a real nice young man, someone she believed genuinely cared for Jocelyn. The shock of her daughter's death was compounded by the horror of the circumstances, and in those initial moments, Green stood beside the family, offering comfort while concealing his guilt. The investigation began immediately, with St. Louis police working to piece together the events of that terrible night. For months, the case remained unsolved, a mystery that haunted Jocelyn's family, her colleagues at Horace Mann Elementary, and the students who had adored their third-grade teacher. Jocelyn was remembered as someone who cared deeply about children, who brought warmth and dedication to her classroom, and whose loss left a void that could never be filled. But as detectives continued their work, examining evidence and following leads, cracks began to appear in Green's story. The investigation into Jocelyn's murder slowly began to point toward the one person who seemed to have the most to lose from her survival: Cornelius Green himself. It would take years for the full truth to emerge. In March 2022, more than 6 years after Jocelyn and Micah Lee were murdered, federal prosecutors finally indicted both Cornelius Green and Philip Cutler on charges of murder for hire and conspiracy to commit murder for hire. The indictment laid bare the calculated nature of the crime, the stolen money, the cross-state planning, the deliberate creation of an alibi, and the cold-blooded execution of a pregnant woman in her own home. The legal proceedings that followed brought the case back into public consciousness, forcing the community to confront the horrific reality that a respected educator had orchestrated the murder of a fellow teacher and their unborn child. The details revealed during the investigation painted a portrait of Green's character that stood in stark contrast to his public persona. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. It was a premeditated act of violence, planned over months, financed through theft, and executed with deliberate precision. On February 29, 2024, in what would become known as a Fry hearing, a last opportunity for federal prosecutors to offer a plea deal before trial, Cornelius Green made a decision. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a trial that would dissect every aspect of his crimes, he pleaded guilty to 1 count of murder for hire and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder for hire. The plea agreement acknowledged the facts of the case, that he had paid Philip Cutler to kill Jocelyn Peters and their unborn daughter, that he had stolen money from the school where he worked to finance the murder, and that he had orchestrated the entire deadly plot. By accepting the plea deal, Green agreed to spend the rest of his life in prison. In exchange, state prosecutors agreed to drop separate murder charges that could have made him eligible for the death penalty. It was a calculation of consequences, a legal maneuver that would spare him from execution but condemn him to die behind bars. Philip Cutler, however, chose a different path. He pleaded not guilty and proceeded to trial, where prosecutors would present the evidence against him. The financial transaction, his travel to St. Louis, the keys provided by Green, and the ballistic evidence from the crime scene. After a 7-day trial, a jury found Cutler guilty. Like Green, he would face the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison for his role in ending 2 innocent lives. On June 25, 2024, United States District Judge Ronnie L. White delivered the sentences that would close the legal chapter of this tragedy. Cornelius Green stood before the court and received 2 consecutive life terms in federal prison, 1 for each life he had taken. There would be no possibility of parole, no chance of redemption, no future beyond the walls of a prison cell. The following month, on July 17th, Philip Cutler stood in the same courtroom and received an identical sentence, 2 consecutive life terms for his role in the murder for hire plot. Judge White's sentences reflected the gravity of the crimes, the premeditated nature of the conspiracy, and the irreversible harm inflicted on Jocelyn, Micah Lee, and everyone who loved them. For Lacey Peters, Jocelyn's mother, the convictions and sentences brought a measure of justice, but they could never restore what had been stolen. She spoke of knowing that her family wasn't the only one in St. Louis that loved her daughter, a testament to the wide circle of people whose lives Jocelyn had touched through her work as an educator and her kindness as a human being. The community where Jocelyn taught mourned not just a colleague, but a dedicated teacher who had shaped young minds and inspired a love of learning. Her students at Horace Mann Elementary lost someone who genuinely cared about their futures, who showed up every day with patience and compassion. The tragedy rippled outward, affecting colleagues who had worked alongside her, parents who had entrusted their children to her care, and an entire school system forced to reckon with the betrayal of one of its own leaders. In the quiet moments after the verdicts and sentences, after the media attention faded and the courtroom doors closed, what remained was the profound absence of Jocelyn Peters and the daughter she never got to hold. The baby shower invitations, scattered across her bed on that terrible night, stood as a haunting symbol of interrupted hope, of a future stolen before it could begin. Jocelyn had been only 30 years old when she died, 7 months into a pregnancy she had fought to protect. She had chosen life for her child despite the obstacles, despite the previous losses, despite the complications of her relationship with Cornelius Green. Her determination to become a mother, to welcome Micah Lee into the world, had been unwavering. That strength, that resolve, made the cruelty of her murder all the more devastating. The case exposed the dangerous intersection of narcissism, deception, and violence, revealing how someone trusted to lead and educate children could harbor such darkness. Cornelius Green's double life, his manipulation of multiple women, his theft from students, and ultimately his willingness to order the execution of his pregnant girlfriend all painted a portrait of moral bankruptcy that shook those who thought they knew him. The financial aspect of the crime, the $2,500 Green stole and paid to Cutler, became a particularly disturbing detail in the public consciousness. That such a small sum could be the price of 2 lives seemed to underscore the depths of depravity involved, a transaction that reduced Jocelyn and Micah Lee to mere obstacles to be eliminated. Years have passed since that March night in 2016, but the echoes of Jocelyn Peters' murder continue to reverberate through St. Louis. The case serves as a reminder of the hidden violence that can lurk behind respectable facades, of the victims whose voices are silenced before they can speak for themselves, and of the children, both born and unborn, who become casualties of adult cruelty. In classrooms throughout the city, teachers continue the work that Jocelyn loved, shaping minds and nurturing potential, carrying forward the legacy of care and dedication she embodied. Though she cannot be there to see her students grow, to watch them learn and discover and become, her impact on those she taught remains. Micah Lee Peters never drew a breath, never opened her eyes to the world her mother had been so carefully preparing for her arrival. The name Jocelyn had chosen, written down and cherished, became a memorial rather than an introduction, a reminder of the life that should have been. In the space where laughter and first words and birthday celebrations should have filled the years, there is only silence and the weight of what might have been. The convictions of Cornelius Green and Philip Cutler brought the legal proceedings to a close, but closure is a more elusive concept for those who loved Jocelyn. Justice, in the form of life sentences, cannot resurrect the dead or grant second chances to those whose futures were stolen. It can only acknowledge the gravity of the crimes and ensure that the perpetrators face consequences proportional to their actions. In the end, the case of Jocelyn Peters stands as a tragedy of staggering proportions, a story of trust betrayed, lives destroyed, and potential extinguished. It reminds us that evil can wear a familiar face, that danger can come from those we believe we know, and that the most vulnerable among us, including children not yet born, deserve protection and justice. The 2 consecutive life sentences handed down to both men involved represent society's definitive statement that such crimes will not be tolerated, that the lives of Jocelyn and Micah Lee mattered, and that their deaths demanded the fullest measure of accountability. As the years continue to pass, as new students fill the classrooms where Jocelyn once taught, her memory endures as both a celebration of the good she brought into the world and a sobering reminder of how quickly that good can be taken away. In a city filled with countless stories, hers remains one that cannot be forgotten, should not be forgotten, a testament to a life cut short and a future that never had the chance to unfold. Story 2. Mother's Day weekend in 2018 was supposed to be a celebration of everything Jolene Cummings cherished most in this world. The approaching Sunday, May 13th, marked not only Mother's Day, but also her 34th birthday, a rare convergence that filled her with anticipation as she prepared to spend the weekend with her 3 children. As a devoted mother who placed her children above all else, Jolene had been looking forward to this special time, planning activities and moments that would create lasting memories with the young people who defined her life's purpose. She arranged to meet her ex-husband Jason Cummings at a Winn-Dixie supermarket in Hilliard, Florida on Sunday to pick up their 2 sons, along with her daughter from a previous relationship, so they could celebrate together. But that reunion would never happen, and the celebration would transform into a nightmare that would haunt Nassau County, Florida for years to come. On Saturday evening, May 12th, Jolene finished her shift at Tangle's Hair Salon in Fernandina Beach at 5 o'clock, just as she did every weekend. The small salon had become her professional home, a place where she had built meaningful relationships with clients who appreciated not just her skill with scissors and color, but also her warm personality and genuine care for the people who sat in her chair. Jolene had studied cosmetology with dreams of one day opening her own salon, and while that vision remained on the horizon, she poured her considerable energy and talent into making every client feel special. Friends described her as someone with a large circle of admirers, a person whom everybody loved, someone whose energy and sense of fun brightened every room she entered. What Jolene didn't know as she locked up the salon that evening was that she would never leave the building alive, and that her body would vanish so completely that, years later, her family would still be searching for answers. Born Jolene Rebecca Jensen in 1984, she had grown up in Nassau County, living with her mother in Johnson and her stepfather in a household filled with the ordinary rhythms of family life. From an early age, Jolene possessed a vibrant spirit that drew people to her, a natural charisma that would serve her well in her chosen profession. After graduating high school, she pursued her passion for hairstyling by studying cosmetology in nearby Jacksonville, Florida, investing in skills that would allow her to build a career helping people feel beautiful and confident. Her personal life followed a path familiar to many young women navigating love and motherhood. She had her first child with a man, though the relationship didn't last, and friends would later reflect that Jolene didn't always pick the best romantic partners despite deserving so much better. In 2013, she married Jason Cummings, and together they welcomed 2 sons, one born in 2013 and another in 2015. For several years, Jolene embraced the demanding but rewarding role of being a mother of 3 while building her career as a hairstylist. Those who knew her best understood that her children came first, always. Jolene was so obsessed with those babies that nothing else mattered, that those kids defined her priorities and guided her decisions. She was the kind of mother who meticulously planned celebrations, who sacrificed for her children's happiness, who measured her success not by professional achievements, but by the smiles on her children's faces. Unfortunately, her marriage to Jason began to falter under the weight of challenges that neither could overcome. In May 2017, the couple filed for divorce, and by the spring of 2018, Jolene was navigating the complicated terrain of single motherhood while sharing custody of their sons with her ex-husband. The separation was emotionally difficult, but Jolene remained focused on providing stability and love for her children, determined that they would feel secure despite the changes in their family structure. By early May 2018, Jolene was building a new chapter of her life, one that included continued dedication to her work at Tangle's hair salon and renewed focus on her role as a mother. But at the salon, tensions were quietly building with a newer employee, a woman who had introduced herself as Jennifer Sibbert and who had been working there for only about a month. Jennifer Sibbert appeared unremarkable when she first began working at Tangle's hair salon in the spring of 2018. Like Jolene, she worked as a hairstylist, serving clients and performing the daily tasks that keep a small business running smoothly. But beneath the surface of normalcy, Sibbert harbored secrets that stretched back decades, secrets that involved a life lived in shadows under a constantly shifting series of false identities. In reality, the woman calling herself Jennifer Sibbert was Kimberly Lee Kessler, a 50-year-old native of Butler, Pennsylvania, who had been living under assumed names for more than 20 years. She had stolen the identity of Jennifer Marie Sibbert from the gravestone of a 16-year-old girl who had died in a car crash in Germany in 1987 and was buried in Butler. This pattern of identity theft from cemetery markers would become a disturbing hallmark of Kessler's methods. She had used at least 17 different aliases, many drawn from gravestones in the same Pennsylvania cemetery. Since 1996, Kessler had lived in 33 cities across 14 different states, moving frequently and reinventing herself with each relocation. She had worked as a truck driver, a hairdresser, in restaurants, and at temporary employment agencies, never staying in one place long enough to form deep connections or invite close scrutiny. She possessed driver's licenses under different names in 4 states, and had established a complex web of false documentation that allowed her to navigate the world as a ghost, leaving no lasting trail. Kessler's mother had reported her missing from Butler County in 2004, when Kimberly was 35 years old, though the disappearance wouldn't be officially documented until 2012. According to later statements, Kessler's mother told police that her daughter had admitted to using aliases to protect herself from a former lover, suggesting a narrative of fear and self-preservation. But as investigators would discover, Kessler's pattern of behavior suggested something far more complex than simple hiding from danger. It revealed a person deeply invested in secrecy, control, and deception. People who encountered Kessler in her various incarnations described her as secretive and paranoid, someone who maintained rigid boundaries and resisted personal questions. At Tangle's hair salon, clients and co-workers noticed tension between her and Jolene Cummings, a friction that seemed to intensify in the days leading up to Jolene's disappearance. Unlike Jolene, who was warm and open with colleagues, Kessler remained guarded, projecting an air of mistrust that made genuine connection impossible. In the first week of May 2018, something shifted in the relationship between Jolene Cummings and the woman she knew as Jennifer Sibbert. Jolene, whose intuition about people had always been strong, began to suspect that her co-worker was not who she claimed to be. She confided in another colleague that she believed Sibbert was hiding something significant, that the identity she presented didn't ring true. With characteristic determination, Jolene announced that she planned to start digging into Sibbert's background to uncover the truth about the mysterious woman who had joined the salon staff. What Jolene didn't realize was that this decision would seal her fate. Unknown to anyone at the salon, Kimberly Kessler had already begun preparing for violence. On May 4th, more than a week before Jolene disappeared, Kessler conducted disturbing searches on her phone, looking up information about how to tie a tourniquet and how to inject someone with a substance. The next day, May 5th, she visited a boating supply store and purchased large-sized zip ties, items that had no obvious connection to her work as a hairstylist. Over the following 48 hours, Kessler made an astonishing 457 searches on her phone containing Jolene's name, an obsessive pattern that revealed the depth of her preoccupation with her co-worker. Most chilling of all, Kessler searched for the phrase "co-worker guilty of murder, missing person body not found," a query that suggested she was already contemplating not just murder, but the possibility of making Jolene disappear without a trace. On May 9th, 3 days before Jolene's disappearance, Nassau County Sheriff's deputies responded to a domestic disturbance at Jolene's home involving her ex-boyfriend Jason G. A neighbor had called authorities after hearing loud arguing and the sound of things being broken inside. G had left before deputies arrived, and Jolene explained that he had shown up wanting to stay, but she had asked him to leave. The incident, while stressful, seemed unrelated to the far greater danger that was quietly closing in on her. The following Saturday, May 12th, brought what should have been an ordinary end to Jolene's work week. She closed the salon around 5 o'clock, completing her final shift before the Mother's Day weekend that would never come. But investigators would later piece together evidence suggesting that after the official closing time, Jolene remained in the salon with Kessler, and that something terrible unfolded in those private hours after the doors were locked. When Sunday, May 13th arrived, Jason Cummings waited at the agreed-upon meeting spot in Hilliard, expecting Jolene to arrive to pick up their children. As minutes turned to hours and she failed to appear, concern began to creep in. Jason tried calling Jolene repeatedly, but his calls went unanswered. Growing increasingly worried, he contacted Jolene's mother and Johnson, hoping she might know where her daughter was, and had not heard from Jolene either, and the silence was completely out of character. Jolene was devoted to her children above all else. She would never voluntarily miss a chance to see them, especially not on Mother's Day and her birthday. As Sunday stretched into Monday with no word from Jolene, the family's worry transformed into genuine alarm. On May 14th, and Johnson contacted the Fernandina Beach Police Department to report her daughter missing. The investigation began immediately, with detectives working to retrace Jolene's final known movements. They spoke with the owner of Tangle's hair salon, who confirmed that Jolene had closed up on May 12th around 5 in the evening. The owner mentioned that Jolene had been working that day with Jennifer Sibbert, the newer employee who had been with the salon for about a month. When detectives attempted to contact Sibbert for questioning, her responses immediately raised red flags. She claimed she couldn't be involved in any law enforcement investigation because she was being stalked by an ex-boyfriend. She insisted she wasn't close with Jolene and had no idea what had happened to her. When investigators returned to the salon to ask more questions, Sibbert's evasiveness intensified. She refused to cooperate, abruptly announced she was quitting her job, and told them to mail her final paycheck because she couldn't be involved in any police activity. Her behavior struck Sheriff Bill Leeper as deeply suspicious. Why would an innocent person with potentially helpful information refuse to assist in a missing person investigation involving a co-worker? The refusal to cooperate, combined with her sudden resignation, suggested she had something significant to hide. On May 15th, authorities received a crucial tip. Someone had spotted Jolene's beige 2006 Ford Expedition sitting empty in the parking lot of a Home Depot in nearby Yulee, Florida. Investigators immediately pulled surveillance footage from the area and discovered something that transformed the missing person case into a criminal investigation. The video showed a woman parking Jolene's vehicle in that lot at precisely 1:17 a.m. on May 13th, just over 7 hours after Jolene would have finished her shift at the salon. The driver was not Jolene Cummings, but Jennifer Sibbert. Armed with this critical piece of evidence, investigators returned to Tangle's hair salon with crime scene specialists and luminol, a chemical that reveals the presence of blood even after attempted cleanup. What they discovered inside the salon was horrifying. Massive amounts of blood residue glowed under the luminol on the walls, chairs, cabinets, and sink. Testing would later confirm that the blood belonged to Jolene Cummings. Someone had attempted to clean the scene, mopping blood off the floor, but the volume of blood and the wide distribution pattern suggested a violent attack had taken place inside the salon. The evidence painted a grim picture. Jolene had been murdered in her workplace, in the space where she had spent years building relationships with clients and creating beauty in people's lives. A bolo, be on the lookout, was immediately issued for Jennifer Sibbert and her black Kia Soul. On the evening of May 16th, authorities located her sleeping in her car at a rest area on Interstate 95 in St. Johns County, Florida. When officers approached to take her into custody, they noticed immediately that she bore visible injuries. She had a nasty cut on her face, injuries on her hands and arms and thighs, and was missing a patch of hair from her head. Her explanation for the facial wound was that she had been riding a bicycle and ran into a tree, but Sheriff Leeper would later state that the injuries didn't match that story. They looked like she had been in a fight. Sibbert was arrested and charged with grand theft auto based on the surveillance footage showing her driving Jolene's vehicle. But as investigators dug deeper into her background, they would uncover far more than simple car theft. Inside Sibbert's car, detectives found Jolene's DNA on socks, boots, and a pair of scissors. They also recovered a blood-stained blue tote bag that Kessler had thrown into the woods. Blood found in a storage locker Kessler had rented was also identified as belonging to Jolene, and one of Jolene's fingernails was discovered inside a bin in that storage unit. The physical evidence was building a devastating case, piece by piece. Perhaps most damning of all was the surveillance footage from the night of May 12th and the early morning hours of May 13th. Cameras captured Sibbert carrying heavy trash bags to a dumpster behind Tangle's hair salon after the salon closed. That night, she was recorded at a Walmart purchasing cleaning supplies, gloves, and an electric carving knife. She then returned to the salon and continued filling the dumpster with large trash bags. Sheriff Leeper would later express his horror at the electric knife purchase, stating that when he saw that item on the receipt, he understood what had happened. Kessler had cut Jolene up, stuffed her into those black trash bags, and thrown her away like garbage. The dumpster had been emptied by a garbage truck before investigators learned of its significance, and its contents were transported to a landfill in Charlton County, Georgia. Despite an exhaustive week-long search through more than 6 million pounds of trash, investigators found several items of interest, but never recovered Jolene's body. After 48 hours in custody, Jennifer Sibbert made a stunning revelation to detectives. In a videotaped interview that would later be viewed by shocked investigators and prosecutors, she calmly explained that she was not who everyone believed her to be. "When you run my fingerprints through, they come up as Kimberly Lee Kessler," she said evenly. "I am 50 years old, and I've been running from the FBI for over 25 years. The admission opened a door into a life of extraordinary deception. Kessler claimed she had run away from home after high school and began living under assumed names after dating a man in Arizona who robbed banks. Investigation into her claims revealed a more complex and troubling picture. Authorities discovered that Kessler had created an elaborate network of false identities, complete with fake documents and identification cards for 18 different aliases. She had systematically moved through the country, living in dozens of cities and working various jobs, always maintaining her anonymity and avoiding detection. The scope of her deception was staggering. It took Sheriff Leeper 5 minutes just to read aloud the list of all the names she had used. She was also charged federally with possession of a counterfeit passport, adding another layer of criminal activity to the investigation. In September 2018, 4 months after Jolene's disappearance, Kimberly Kessler was formally charged with first-degree premeditated murder. The indictment marked the beginning of a legal process that would stretch across more than 3 years, delayed in part by Kessler's own disturbing behavior while in custody. While awaiting trial, Kessler engaged in repeated hunger strikes, lost more than half her body weight, and accused jail officials of trying to poison her. She regularly exhibited bizarre behavior, including stripping naked and smearing feces in her cell. She was charged with 2 counts of battery on a law enforcement officer after throwing feces at them. She refused to cooperate with her own defense attorneys, creating additional complications in preparing for trial. At one point, she was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial. However, after careful evaluation, a judge later ruled that she was capable of understanding the case against her, determining that her behaviors were volitional in nature and the result of a personality disorder rather than a diagnosed mental illness. The ruling cleared the way for her trial to proceed. In December 2021, 3.5 years after Jolene was last seen, Kimberly Kessler finally stood trial for first-degree murder in her presumed death. Prosecutors presented the overwhelming evidence: the blood throughout the salon, the surveillance footage of Kessler disposing of trash bags and purchasing supplies, the DNA evidence, the internet searches, and the timeline that placed Kessler as the last person to see Jolene alive. The defense argued that Kessler and Jolene had gotten into a fight and that the blood evidence was the result of Kessler defending herself. The jury didn't buy it. After deliberating for only a little over an hour, they returned with a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder and grand theft auto. On January 27, 2022, Judge James Daniel sentenced Kimberly Kessler to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She would spend the rest of her days behind bars, paying for the life she had stolen and the family she had destroyed. Outside the Nassau County Courthouse on the day of the verdict, and Johnson stood with family members and spoke to reporters with tears streaming down her face. She praised God for the verdict, expressing gratitude that it gave them some type of closure. But even as she spoke of relief, the profound pain of her loss was evident in every word. "While my daughter Jolene has not been found, we have, at least, the verdict of the indictment of first-degree premeditated murder," she said. "We miss Jolene every second of the day, my family, our families, the Cummings families, the children. Not a day goes by. But I really feel like Jolene is with us today. I felt like she's actually been in that courtroom with us." The absence of Jolene's body remained an open wound for the family. Without physical remains to lay to rest, without a grave to visit, the grieving process remained incomplete, suspended in the terrible limbo of knowing she was gone, but having nowhere to direct their mourning. For Jolene's 3 children, the loss was immeasurable. They had lost their mother on what should have been a day of celebration, a Mother's Day that would forever be associated with absence and heartbreak. Jason Cummings, speaking publicly for the first time in May 2022, expressed the ongoing challenge of helping the children understand that while their mother's body had not been found, they could be assured she was in heaven being looked after. The community that had known and loved Jolene rallied around her family in the months and years following her disappearance. Fundraisers were organized to help support her 3 children financially, recognizing that the family had relied on Jolene's income and now faced significant hardship. And Johnson would later tell reporters that the outpouring of support left her at a loss for words, describing it as so much love it's indescribable. The case stands as a chilling reminder of how people can hide in plain sight, using false identities and manufactured personas to escape their pasts and evade accountability. Kimberly Kessler's ability to live under 18 different names across 14 states for more than 2 decades raises troubling questions about the ease with which someone can disappear into anonymity in modern America. Most poignantly, the case illustrates the devastating impact of violence against mothers, the ripple effects that extend outward to touch children, extended family, friends, colleagues, and entire communities. Jolene's 3 children grew up without their mother's guidance, without her presence at school events and birthdays, without the daily love and support that should have been their birthright. The search for Jolene's remains continues to this day, though with each passing year the likelihood of recovery diminishes. Somewhere in the landfills of Georgia or the waterways of Florida, or some other location known only to Kimberly Kessler, Jolene Cummings rests in an unmarked grave, denied even the dignity of a proper burial. In the hearts of those who knew her, however, Jolene remains vibrantly alive. She is remembered as a devoted mother who placed her children above all else, a talented hairstylist who brought joy to her clients, a friend whose energy and fun-loving spirit brightened every gathering, and a woman whose life had value and meaning far beyond the brutal way it ended. The conviction of Kimberly Kessler brought legal closure to the case, ensuring that the woman responsible for Jolene's murder would never walk free again. But true closure, the kind that brings peace to grieving hearts, remains elusive for a family still searching for their daughter, sister, and mother. They carry on with the weight of unanswered questions, sustained by faith, community support, and the enduring love they hold for the woman whose life was stolen on what should have been the happiest of weekends. Jolene Cummings was 33 years old when she died, just 1 day shy of her 34th birthday. She left behind 3 children who needed her, a mother who cherished her, friends who valued her, and a community that recognized her worth. Though Kimberly Kessler succeeded in taking Jolene's life and hiding her body, she could not erase the impact Jolene had on the world or diminish the love that continues to surround her memory. That love endures, a testament to a life well lived and a reminder that even in the darkest tragedies, the light of human connection cannot be extinguished. Story 3. The sky over Sarasota wore the soft colors of a Florida winter, that strange season where Christmas lights glow against palm trees, and the air carries a hint of coolness without ever really turning cold. It was February 1st, 2004, a Sunday that felt like any other. Families came home from errands, neighbors rolled their trash cans to the curb, and a quiet girl with long, light brown hair stepped out of a house to walk back to her own. Her name was Carly Jane Brucia. She was 11 years old. In the fading light, she wore a bright pink t-shirt with angel printed across the front, blue jeans, and sandals. Her hair fell in waves down her back. The street she walked along was familiar, the kind of everyday path a child takes without thinking. Past small businesses, through a car wash parking lot, along sidewalks where tires hiss on pavement and neon signs flicker to life as the sun goes down. She was headed back to her home after visiting a friend, taking what should have been a simple, short walk. Somewhere very close by, a man watched her. He was older, in his mid-30s, with dark hair and tattoos, wearing a work shirt and jeans. To anyone glancing quickly, he might have looked like a mechanic or a laborer heading home after a long day. But he was not thinking about going home. He was watching the small figure in pink and denim crossing the car wash lot, and he was making a choice that would shatter more lives than his own. The car wash had security cameras mounted high under its eaves. Their lenses stared down without emotion at the slow drift of cars and people. They captured what happened next in a series of grainy frames that would soon become some of the most haunting images in America. As Carly walked, looking down, the man stepped into her path. He spoke to her. The video shows his mouth moving, his body angled toward her, his arm gesturing. She stopped, hesitated. It was the kind of moment that passes unnoticed all over the world. An adult asking a child for directions, perhaps, or making some quick, casual inquiry. But as the seconds ticked by, his posture shifted. He moved closer. His hand reached out, resting on her shoulder. The tape catches it all. The way she seems to pause, uncertain, the way he leans in. Then, gently but firmly, his arm goes around her neck in a loose headlock. Together they begin to walk out of frame, his grip tightening just slightly, hers compliant at first, then stiff. Within seconds, they vanish beyond the camera's view. It would take only a short time for her family to realize she had not come home. It would take longer for authorities to understand that those few seconds of video were the last images anyone would ever see of her alive. The man's name was Joseph P. Smith, and what he did that night would turn a local missing child case into a national nightmare. Earlier that day, the Brucia household had been busy in the ordinary way of families everywhere. Carly lived with her mother, Susan Schoen, her stepfather, and her younger sister in a modest Sarasota home. Her biological father, Joe Brucia, loved her deeply but no longer lived in the house. Their blended family had its share of stresses, but Carly herself was the kind of child adults describe with soft affection. Quiet but friendly, gentle, shy around strangers, devoted to her younger sister. She loved drawing and animals. She enjoyed simple things, movies, friends, sleepovers. She was just beginning to move toward adolescence, with all its confusion and possibility, still half child, half young woman. She was not reckless. She was not wild. She was, in many ways, the kind of kid parents think of when they tell themselves, "My child would never get into a stranger's car." That Sunday, she had been allowed to visit a friend who lived nearby. The neighborhood was not considered dangerous. Sarasota, with its beaches and retirees and tourist traffic, felt safe in the way many sun-washed towns do. Children walked short distances. Parents worried more about grades and peer pressure than about predators on their doorsteps. When it was time for Carly to come home, she left the friend's house on foot. The route took her along a commercial stretch of road, small shops, a car wash, parking lots, and side streets. The light was dimming but not yet gone. People were out. Cars passed. It was not some isolated dirt road or hidden path. It was a place where anyone might reasonably expect a child to be safe. But Carly was not walking through an empty world. Somewhere nearby, Joseph Smith had already made up his mind. Smith was 37 years old that winter, a man with a long and tangled history of crime and addiction. He had grown up in New York, then drifted through life in Florida as a mechanic, laborer, and more often than not, a defendant in front of judges tired of hearing his name. His criminal record ran back years, a scattered list of drug offenses, thefts, probation violations, and at least one prior accusation of abducting a woman at knife point. He was, in many ways, the kind of man the system knew all too well. In and out of jail, in and out of rehab, always on the edge of some new trouble. He used heroin. He struggled to hold jobs. He had a wife and children, but his addictions and anger had chipped away at his ability to be a stable presence in anyone's life. By early 2004, he was out on supervision, free to move through the city. He owed the state many explanations, but none of them would be demanded of him on that Sunday evening, as he walked near the car wash on Bee Ridge Road and saw an 11-year-old girl walking alone. What went through his mind as he watched her, no one will ever know completely, but we can trace what he did after that moment in the car wash lot, step by deliberate step. He closed the distance between them. When Carly did not arrive home on time, her family noticed quickly. At first there was confusion. Maybe she'd stayed longer at her friend's house, Maybe she'd stopped at a store. Maybe she was walking more slowly than usual. But as minutes stretched into an hour, concern hardened into fear. Her mother called around. No one had seen her. Then came the call to law enforcement. In missing child cases, time is both enemy and ruler. Investigators know that the first hours after a disappearance are crucial, especially if foul play is involved. Sarasota County authorities responded with urgency. They took statements from family and friends, mapped out her likely route, and began canvassing the area. Meanwhile, the Brucia family entered the agony familiar to every parent whose child has vanished. Waiting, hoping, bargaining silently in their minds with anything that might be listening. Maybe she got lost. Maybe she's with someone safe. Maybe. Police requested access to security footage from businesses along the way. The car wash camera was one of the first they checked. They threaded the tape through the playback system and watched, eyes scanning the grainy images for any sign of a small girl in a pink shirt. For a while there was nothing but cars pulling in and out, people washing vehicles, the ordinary parade of a Sunday afternoon. Then, at 6:21 p.m., they saw her. She walked into the frame from the right, head slightly bowed, long hair swinging. Even in low resolution, her shirt was clearly visible, pink with the word angel stretching across the front. For a moment, she was just a girl walking, unaware that she had entered a camera's fixed gaze. Then, from the left, the man appeared. Officers leaned in. They watched him approach, watched the conversation unfold in silence, watched his hand come down on her shoulder. The image was grainy, but the meaning was crystal clear. This was no father taking his daughter home. The body language betrayed something else, a subtle imbalance of power, a small tension in the girl's posture. They watched him steer her out of frame. When the tape ended, the room was quiet. The case was no longer just a missing child. It was unmistakably an abduction. The decision was made quickly. The public needed to see this. Within hours, the video clip was copied, edited, and sent to local and national media. News stations ran it repeatedly, the same few seconds replaying over and over. Carly walking, the stranger approaching, his arm draping around her, the two of them disappearing at the edge of the frame. Anchors spoke with grave voices about a possible kidnapper. Crawling text at the bottom of the screen displayed phone numbers for tips. Across Florida and beyond, people sat in living rooms and watched in horror. Many saw their own children in that small figure in pink, caught in a moment that no one could rewind. The man's face, though partly shadowed, was visible enough. His jawline, his hair, the tattoos marking his arms. As the video aired again and again, phones began to ring. Tips flooded in. Some were vague, others contradictory, but a few were strikingly specific. People who had known Joseph Smith, neighbors, acquaintances, even members of his own family, called to say the same thing. That looks like him. Detectives began to circle his name. Smith, for his part, tried to keep moving. He went to his brother John's house. He kept his distance from the police. He changed his story about where he'd been and what he'd done. But it is difficult to hide when your face has been broadcast to millions, and soon enough, officers were at his door. They took him into custody not for murder. No body had yet been found, but for an unrelated violation. Driving with a suspended license, a charge that allowed them to hold him while they dug deeper into his connection with the girl in the pink angel shirt. Time, though, was slipping away. For days, search teams spread out across Sarasota County. Deputies, detectives, volunteers, and canine units walked through brush, combed ditches, checked vacant lots. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping the humid air. Flyers bearing Carly's school photo, her soft, serious eyes and gentle smile, were posted on telephone poles, storefronts, and gas station windows. Her parents spoke to the media, their faces drawn with worry. Her father's voice broke as he pleaded for her safe return. Her mother, hollow-eyed with exhaustion, begged anyone who knew anything to come forward. In their words you could hear both the desperate hope that she might still be alive and the creeping fear that she might not. Investigators pressed Smith for answers. At first he denied everything. Then his story shifted. He admitted he had been near the car wash, that he had been using drugs, that his memory was foggy. Detective after detective tried to find a crack in his defenses, a moment when he would decide to tell the truth. But if there was any part of him that felt remorse, it did not surface in time to change what had been done. 5 days after Carly vanished, the call came from a rough, overgrown lot behind a church on the edge of town. A deputy searching the area had noticed something in the brush, a piece of fabric, a shape that did not belong. As they pushed through the weeds and broken branches, they found her. She lay partially hidden in the scrub and dirt, the pink fabric of her shirt dulled by layer of soil and leaves. The Florida air was heavy around her. She had been there outside alone for days. The image that greeted the officers was one that would burn itself into their memories. The body of an 11-year-old child, discarded like something that did not matter. The wave of grief that rolled through her family and community was immediate and crushing. The hope that had flickered, however faintly, in those searching days went dark. Carly was gone. The medical examiner's findings would later confirm what many had already feared in their hearts. Carly had been sexually assaulted. The cause of death was strangulation. The brutality of the crime stood in sharp, ugly contrast with the tenderness of the child it had claimed. Physical evidence tied Joseph Smith to that patch of ground and to Carly herself. Fibers, DNA, and other forensic traces formed an invisible chain between his body, his clothing, his car, and the place where she was found. He had no credible explanation for these links. His lies grew thinner as the case against him grew thicker. Prosecutors in Sarasota County prepared to charge him with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. They understood that this would not be just another trial. The video from the car wash had already seared itself into the public consciousness. People had watched helpless as an 11-year-old was led away by a stranger. Now those same people wanted accountability. For the Brucia family, the days between her discovery and the trial passed in a blur of funerals, interviews, and the kind of paperwork no parent should ever have to sign. They chose a coffin. They chose flowers. They stood in a church and listened to words meant to comfort the inconsolable. Her classmates, stunned, left notes and drawings, small offerings of grief from children still learning what death really means. At her funeral, her father's voice shook as he spoke about the loss of his daughter, about the hole in their lives that could never be filled. There was a gentleness to the way people spoke her name, as if saying it too harshly might break something already fragile. Outside, the world went on. Cars moved, waves rolled onto the beach, tourists wandered downtown. But for those who loved Carly, time split into a before and an after, and nothing in the after looked the same. When the trial finally began, it drew intense attention not just from Florida but from across the country. In the courtroom, under bright lights and high ceilings, the man from the video now sat wearing a suit and shackles. His hair was neatly cut. His face was calmer than the one people had seen leaning over a small girl in a parking lot. But the tattoos on his arms, partly visible under his sleeves, and the deep lines etched around his mouth hinted at the life he had lived before that February evening. The prosecution's case was methodical. They called witnesses who could identify him as the man in the video, including relatives who had recognized him immediately. They called investigators who described the search, the discovery of the body, the collection of evidence. Forensic experts explained DNA matches and fiber analyses in clear, patient language, walking the jury through each link. Most haunting of all, they played the security video. The courtroom watched as the images flickered on the screen. Carly walking, the man approaching, the brief exchange, the arm on her shoulder, the two of them moving out of frame. Even though everyone in the room knew how the story ended, the moment when she disappeared off-screen landed like a blow. Her family sat in the gallery, forced to relive their worst day in the most public way possible. They looked at the man who had taken their child's life and listened as lawyers described, in precise but restrained language, what he had done to her. The defense tried to sow doubt. They suggested that the video was unclear, that Smith's memory was impaired by drugs, that there was not enough direct evidence to prove he had murdered her intentionally. They questioned expert witnesses. They argued that the state's case was circumstantial. But the jury saw more than a series of disconnected facts. They saw a line that began with a girl in a pink angel shirt and ended in a patch of scrub behind a church. In 2005, they found Joseph Smith guilty on all major counts. During the penalty phase, prosecutors asked for the ultimate punishment, death. They spoke of the vulnerability of the victim, her age, the cruelty of the crime. The defense asked the jury to consider Smith's long history of addiction and mental health struggles as mitigating factors. They described a childhood marked by instability, an adulthood derailed by heroin, a man whose choices had been terrible but who, they argued, might still be spared execution. The jurors weighed it all, the horror of the crime, the life of the defendant, the aching grief of the family seated just feet away. They recommended a sentence of death. The judge agreed. For the Brucia family, the verdict and sentence brought a measure of formal justice, but little in the way of peace. No court order, no matter how severe, could return Carly to her mother's arms or her sister's laughter. Justice, in this case, was not restoration, it was acknowledgement. As the legal battles continued through appeals, Carly's story reverberated far beyond Sarasota. The video of her abduction was shown in schools, in law enforcement trainings, in news specials about child safety. Her case became a painful, unforgettable example of how quickly a child can be taken, even in a public place, even in a familiar neighborhood. People talked about stranger danger in new ways. The video cut through the comforting myth that kidnappings are usually chaotic, violent struggles that would immediately draw attention. Here, the man had approached her calmly, his posture relaxed, his movements controlled. To a passerby, it might have looked like a father guiding a reluctant child. To the camera, and now to the world, it was something very different. Carly's name became attached to efforts to strengthen the systems meant to protect children. In the years that followed, Florida authorities and advocates pointed to her case in discussions about probation practices and offender supervision. People asked hard questions. Why had a man with Smith's record been free? Could different decisions earlier in his criminal history have prevented him from standing in that car wash lot on that February evening? How many warning signs had been missed or minimized? Her father, Joe, carried his grief into the public sphere. He spoke at events. He stood beside officials as they announced policy changes. He pushed for reforms in how law enforcement and probation officers handled repeat offenders with violent histories. Each time he spoke his daughter's name, it was both a tribute and a plea. Yet for her mother, her father, her sister, and the classmates who had once laughed with her in school hallways, these efforts, however important, always existed alongside the quiet, private moments of remembrance that never make the news. In the years since her death, those who knew Carly have had to find ways to live in a world where she is forever 11. There are birthdays she did not reach, school dances she never attended, holidays where her absence at the table was a presence of its own. Her sister grew older, moving into stages of life Carly never saw, high school, adulthood, perhaps marriage or children. Each milestone carried with it a shadow, the awareness that someone was missing. For her parents, memory is both comfort and wound. They remember the weight of her in their arms when she was small, the way her hair smelled after a day at the beach, the sound of her footsteps coming down the hall. They also remember the awful silence of the days she was missing, the moment they were told her body had been found, the way their knees almost gave out under them. When they speak of her now, they try as much as possible to talk about her life, not just her death. They recall her gentleness, her affection for her younger sister, her shy smile. Friends remember the little things, a joke she liked, the way she doodled in the margins of her notebooks, the way she would sometimes hang back in a group, observing more than speaking. At the same time, they know that for many people who never met her, Carly will always be the girl in the pink t-shirt on that car wash video. It is a strange kind of immortality, frozen in a few blurred seconds. But beyond that clip, there was a whole person, a child who loved, who worried, who dreamed. To honor her fully is to hold both realities at once. The image that shocked a nation, and the inner life that only those close to her can truly know. When we tell the story of what happened to Carly Jane Brucia, It is tempting to focus only on the horror, to fixate on the wrong turn of a single evening and the man who stole her future. But there is another way to carry her story, one that acknowledges the darkest parts while also recognizing what came out of them. Her death exposed gaps in systems meant to protect children, and it pushed adults, parents, police, lawmakers, to confront the truth that danger can appear in ordinary places, wearing an ordinary face. It led to changes in law and policy that have, in many documented cases, helped keep other children safer. More quietly, it changed the way many families talk with their children. Because of her, some parents who once might have said, "Don't talk to strangers," now add, "And if anyone, even someone you think you know, ever makes you feel uncomfortable, you can tell me, and I will believe you." Because of her, some kids learned that they have the right to walk away from an adult who tries to pull them aside, to shout for help, to trust the uneasy feeling in their stomach. None of that erases what happened behind that church lot. None of it makes up for an empty bedroom, for school photos that stopped after 5th grade. But it does mean that the line of her story extends beyond that terrible night, touching lives of children who will never know their debt to an 11-year-old in Sarasota. If you stand even now near the place where she was taken, the car wash hums with the same everyday sounds. Hoses spraying water, brushes spinning, engines idling. People drive past without thinking of what a camera there once recorded. The sky changes colors. The world moves on. Yet somewhere in the hum of tires and the murmur of voices, there remains an echo of a small girl walking alone in a pink angel t-shirt, trusting that the path between a friend's house and home was hers to travel in safety. The man who stepped into that path took her choice away, but he did not erase who she was. In telling her story, in speaking her name, in shaping laws and lessons and quiet promises in her memory, people have refused to let her be only what he made of her in those final hours. They have chosen instead to remember her as she deserved to be remembered, as a child loved beyond measure whose life, though cut short, continues to ripple outward in ways she never could have imagined. And somewhere in that knowledge there is a solemn, enduring vow that her last walk will not be forgotten, and that, because of her, more children will reach home. Story 4. The rain had already started by the time the last bell rang at Greenbrier Junior High, a slow, steady drizzle that blurred the yellow buses into hazy shapes in the late afternoon light. Inside the halls, the air smelled of damp clothes and pencil shavings, of gym sweat and cafeteria pizza, of 100 small lives in motion. Among them was a slight, blonde girl with bright, thoughtful eyes and a limp that made her walk just a little slower than the others. Her name was Casey Renee Woody, and at 13 years old she was quietly, fiercely determined not to be defined by the accident that had tried to take her life 2 years earlier. She hugged a stack of books against her chest as she navigated the crowd, weaving between taller kids and lockers slammed too hard. To anyone watching, she looked like another 7th grader in oversized jeans and an Arkansas Razorbacks hoodie, but inside she carried more grief and courage than most adults she passed in the hallway. Outside, the rain tapped on the windows like fingertips. Inside, she was already thinking about home, about the software of the family computer in the corner of the living room and the glowing portal that had become her refuge. An AOL chat window where, for a few hours each night, she could step out of her small town and into a wider, kinder world. At least, that was what she believed. She had no way of knowing that someone far away had been watching her through that screen, patient and relentless, waiting for a night when the house would be quiet, when the rain would hide the sound of tires on the road, when a trusting child would open her front door because she thought she knew who was on the other side. By the time the rain stopped, it would already be too late. In Greenbrier, Arkansas, the houses stood back from the road, separated by fields and lines of trees that turned black at nightfall. The Woody home sat off a narrow road, a modest place with a yard where Casey's dog would bark at passing cars, and an interior that tried to hold on to warmth despite the chill of tragedy that clung to the family. Casey's mother, Julie, had died in a car accident when Casey was just a little girl. The loss had cracked the family open, leaving Casey, her brother Tim, and their father, Rick Woody, to patch themselves together as best they could. They were close in the way people become when they've survived something terrible together. There were jokes at the dinner table to cut through the sadness, and there were nights when the house felt too quiet, when Casey would retreat to her room or to the computer and slip into the digital spaces where the past didn't hurt quite as much. 2 years before the night that would change everything, another accident had almost taken her as well. A car had slammed into their van on a wet road, leaving Casey with severe injuries. Doctors weren't sure she'd ever walk again, but she had fought for every step, relearning the simple mechanics the rest of the world took for granted. She walked with a limp now, her gait distinct and careful, but she walked. That mattered to her. It was proof that she could come back from anything. The people who knew her describe her as thoughtful, kind, and a little shy around strangers, but open and eager with the people she trusted. She loved horses. She liked to read. She could be silly with her friends, giggling over inside jokes and school gossip. Like so many kids her age in 2002, she had found a new social universe on the internet. Chat rooms, instant messages, away messages decorated with song lyrics. It felt exhilarating and safe, a place where she could talk to people who didn't immediately see her limp or know her family story. One of those people was a boy named Scott. That was the name he used anyway. It began the way so many online friendships did in those early years of widespread home internet. The soft scratch of the dial-up modem, the sign-on chime, the cascade of buddy list names lighting up. For Casey, the computer offered more than entertainment. It gave her connection in a rural town where evenings were quiet and her father worked nights as a police officer. He trusted her, and he believed he had good reason to. He was a cop. He knew danger when he saw it in the real world. At work, he arrested drunk drivers, responded to calls, carried the weight of other people's worst days. At home, he tried to keep his children's world intact, to give them something resembling normal. The computer stood in the open, not hidden in a bedroom. He would walk past and see her typing, see the cheerful lines of text fill the screen, hear her laugh sometimes at whatever someone on the other side had said. He set rules. She wasn't supposed to share personal information. She wasn't supposed to meet anyone from online in person. It was 2002, and even then the phrase "internet predator" was beginning to circulate. But it still felt distant, like a term from a news report about some other place, some other family. In her chat windows, Scott presented himself as a boy not much older than she was. A handsome 16-year-old from California, he said. He sent her pictures, images of a smiling teenager with styled hair and easy confidence. He wrote with the casual charm of someone used to being liked. He told her he understood her, that she could talk to him about anything. He listened when she talked about her mom, about the accident, about the loneliness that sometimes sat on her chest like something heavy and invisible. "When I get there," he typed once, as they talked late into the night, "I'll take care of you." She believed him, because she wanted to believe that someone out there, in the wide world beyond Arkansas, saw her and chose her. She told her friends about him, this cute older boy who lived so far away but who felt, through the glow of the monitor, almost close enough to touch. She took comfort in those conversations. To her, they felt like the beginning of something good. She did not know that the photographs belonged to someone else entirely, that the 16-year-old face on her screen had no idea it was being used like a mask. She did not know that behind the pleasant words and patient attention was not a boy, but a man in his 40s, thousands of miles away, carefully plotting. His real name was David Fuller. Fuller lived in California and worked as a mall security guard. On the surface, he was an unremarkable middle-aged man in a world that barely noticed him. He was divorced. He was lonely. But inside, something darker had taken root and flourished, a predatory obsession that drew him toward young girls, toward the particular vulnerability of those who shared their thoughts freely through keyboards and screens. He spent long hours in online chat rooms, creating and refining the persona of Scott. He downloaded pictures of attractive teenage boys and used them as his own. He learned to mimic their style of speech, to pick up the slang and rhythms that would make him seem convincing to a 13-year-old in Arkansas. He watched for girls who spoke of sadness, who mentioned strict parents or loneliness or the feeling of being misunderstood. When he found Casey, he found exactly what he was looking for: a kind, open girl with a history of grief, living in a small town where the internet felt like a doorway to something larger and kinder. He studied her. He learned about her family, about her schedule. He learned that her father worked nights, that sometimes she and her friends stayed at her house while her brother was elsewhere. Each new detail lodged in his mind as another piece of the puzzle he was building. There is a kind of patience to predation that is difficult to comprehend from the outside. Fuller waited. He did not push her to meet him immediately. Instead, he deepened the trust, made himself into someone she relied on emotionally. Little by little, he asked for more personal details, more openness, more vulnerability. He was not alone in his deceptions. At one point, he introduced another online acquaintance into the orbit of Casey and her friends, a man named John who posed as David, another supposed teenager. Together, the two adult men created overlapping fictions, crafting a small web where the girls felt surrounded by friendly, supportive boys who liked them, who listened. The boundaries between reality and fabrication grew hazier with each conversation. In Greenbrier, the days went on in their familiar pattern: school, homework, family meals, the quiet of country nights. On the screen, though, a parallel narrative was unfolding, one that would eventually push its way brutally into the real world. By December 2002, Fuller had decided he wouldn't be satisfied with messages and carefully chosen photos. He wanted proximity. He wanted control. He wanted to close the distance between California and Arkansas. He got in his car and started to drive. The day it happened, the air in Greenbrier held the particular damp chill of early winter in Arkansas. Christmas decorations glowed from front porches and living room windows. At the Woody home, plans were ordinary. Casey's father would be working an overnight shift. A family friend, someone they trusted deeply, would stay at the house to keep an eye on the kids. It was a small precaution in a quiet town where people still left their doors unlocked, where most worries revolved around school grades and muddy boots rather than anything truly dangerous. That night, Casey invited her best friend over. They stayed at the house with the babysitter, talking, laughing, watching TV, doing the bright, ordinary things girls do when they feel safe. The computer hummed in the corner, as familiar a part of the household as the coffee table or the couch. At some point in the evening, as darkness settled over the fields around the house, the instant messages began again. Scott was online. He had been planning this moment for weeks. He knew that Rick would be on duty. He knew there would be an adult at the house, but not one with a gun and a badge. He had driven all the way from California to Arkansas, hauling behind him a rented storage unit. A metal box on wheels that looked unremarkable, just another container moving down interstate highways. Inside it, he had placed rope, restraints, and a small mattress. The messages that night were routine, at least at first. "What are you doing? Who's there? Are you alone?" He would have been careful, easing through the conversation the way he had so many times before. It is difficult to know exactly how he convinced her to step outside, whether he twisted her trust directly, or whether he played on guilt, on her desire not to disappoint the boy she believed cared for her. We only know the outcome. At some point, she opened the door. Her friend would later say that she saw Casey near the doorway, that the night's small sounds drifted in, wind in the trees, a car somewhere on the road. The babysitter believed the girls were still inside. It was late, but not so late that anyone thought much of footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the floorboards. Outside, the fields lay dark and wide. A vehicle idled quietly, its lights probably off. Somewhere close by, the rented storage unit waited, its metal shell hiding the reality of what it had been turned into. When the door closed behind Casey, the line between digital fantasy and physical danger vanished. The first sign that something was wrong came with silence. Her friend noticed she was gone. Minutes passed, then more. At first, it was easy to assume she had stepped outside to grab something, to check on the dog, to talk to someone. But as the minutes stretched and no familiar footfall returned, worry began to grow. The babysitter realized she hadn't seen her either. The normal quiet of the Woody home now felt different, heavy and wrong. Calls were made. Her father was notified. For a police officer, there is a particular terror in hearing that something has happened not to a stranger, but to your own child. Rick moved from professional concern to personal panic in a heartbeat. He knew his daughter. He knew she wasn't the kind of child who would run away without a word. The dread that took hold of him was sharp and clear. This was not a misunderstanding. Something had happened. Law enforcement responded swiftly. Greenbrier was small, but the ties within its institutions were strong. Officers who had worked alongside Rick now joined him in searching for his daughter. They checked the house, the property, the nearby roads. In the digital age, they did something else as well. They turned to the computer. On the screen, chat logs remained open. Messages glowed in the familiar neon text. Usernames, including Scott, marked lines of conversation where Casey had poured out her trust. As investigators scrolled through the exchanges, patterns emerged. The supposed age of the boy, his alleged location, the things he had said. They realized that while the family had seen this as a harmless friendship, it had been something far more sinister. They issued alerts. They traced what they could, but hours matter in a missing child case, and each passing one tightened the knot in everyone's chest. Somewhere, not very far away, in the rented storage unit parked off a rural road, Casey was alone with the man she had known only as Scott. The image of that storage unit is difficult to shake. Inside the metal walls, the air must have been cold and stale. There was no window, no natural light, just the confined space where Fuller had brought a child who had once believed she was going to meet a kind older boy from California. How quickly her hope must have turned to confusion, then to terror, when she saw the truth of who stood before her. He had abducted her from her home, driven to the storage unit he had prepared, and held her there briefly. At some point in those dark hours, he killed her. He left her body in the unit, a stolen life in a rented box, and fled. He could not outrun what he had set in motion. As the investigation intensified, officers tracked down clues that pointed them to the storage facility. When they approached the unit Fuller had rented, they found his vehicle nearby. The scene that awaited them when they opened the door would remain etched in their memories. Inside, they found Casey. She was lifeless, her body bearing the clear marks of what had been done to her. The brutality of the crime collided with the innocence of its victim in a way that was almost unbearable. Officers who had children of their own, who knew Casey not as a file but as their colleague's daughter, stood in that space and confronted what one man's deceit and obsession had taken from her family, from the community. Fuller was not there to face them. He had moved on, but not far. Police traced him to a motel, where he had taken a room in the hours after the killing. When they surrounded the place and moved in, prepared to arrest him, they heard the gunshot. He had turned the weapon on himself. There would be no trial, no courtroom testimony, no chance for Casey's father to look him in the eye and speak of what he had taken. Fuller's death ended the investigation in a legal sense, but it did nothing to relieve the grief that now settled like a weight on everyone who had loved Casey. What remained was a small town struggling to understand how a man could cross half a continent to steal a child from her home, and how a screen that glowed so harmlessly in a family's living room could have become the doorway through which he slipped into their lives. In the weeks that followed, the Woody home filled with people and flowers and a silence that seemed to linger even when the house was crowded. Neighbors brought casseroles and held hands and tried to find words that could stand up against the enormity of the loss. Most of them failed. There are things for which language is inadequate. For Rick, there was almost no separation between his roles as a father and as a law enforcement officer. He had dedicated his career to protecting others, only to lose his own child to a predator who had used an emerging technology to bypass the safeguards he trusted. The guilt and fury he felt were heavy, but beneath them, something else formed. A resolve that what had happened to Casey would not be forgotten, and that her story would not end in a storage unit. The community grieved her as more than a name and a headline. She had been their neighbor, their friend's child, the girl they had watched limp down the school hallway with stubborn determination. Teachers remembered her quiet effort. Classmates remembered her laughter. Her brother remembered all the small, ordinary moments, shared jokes, arguments, the way she left her things scattered where they didn't belong, that now became painfully precious. At her funeral, she was honored not only as a victim, but as a person, a girl who had loved horses and music, who had faced down pain with a bravery her years did not yet fully explain. The church filled with people who promised themselves they would never allow anyone to say that she had simply talked to the wrong person online, as if the blame could somehow shift to her young shoulders. They knew better. They had seen the reality of the man who had hunted her. Her story began to move beyond Greenbrier. News coverage spread, first locally and then nationally, as people tried to understand how this had happened and what it meant for families everywhere who had watched their children chat online in the glow of family room computers. There was horror, of course, but also a dawning realization. The internet, still relatively new to many households, could be as dangerous as any dark alley, if not approached with care. For Rick, grief became action. In the years that followed, he and others who loved Casey turned her story into a warning, a painful, necessary lesson about online predators and the importance of vigilance. He spoke publicly about what had happened, not because it was easy to relive those details, but because he believed that if even one child was saved by hearing his daughter's story, then some small piece of meaning could be wrested from the senselessness. He talked about the way Fuller had constructed his persona, about the false pictures and invented age, about how easily a clever adult with malicious intent could step into a teenager's world and speak their language. He emphasized that the computer in their home had not been hidden, that he had considered himself careful. The point he drove home, again and again, was that predators are not always obvious, and that trust online must be guarded more fiercely than trust in face-to-face encounters. Schools and community organizations began to use Casey's story in their internet safety programs. Police departments referenced her case when they spoke to parents about monitoring their children's online activity, about understanding the platforms their kids used, about the importance of open, honest conversations. Her name became a touchstone in discussions about the dangers of chat rooms and social media, a reminder that behind every username could be someone very different from who they claimed to be. For many parents and teenagers, hearing her story shifted the way they thought about digital spaces. It made the abstract concept of online predators painfully real. It anchored the warnings in a face, a 13-year-old girl with blonde hair and a determined walk, who had survived one life-threatening accident only to be taken by a stranger she had trusted in the glow of a computer screen. Yet in the midst of the teaching and the warnings, those who loved her insisted on remembering more than just the way she died. They remembered the way she lived. To imagine Casey only as a victim is to flatten her into the worst thing that ever happened to her. The people who knew her hold a different image. A girl leaning against a fence, hand outstretched to a horse whose breath fogs in the morning air. A girl laughing on the phone with a friend, tracing circles on a notebook as she listens. A girl stubbornly lifting one foot and then the other during physical therapy, refusing to accept that she might not walk again. They speak of her kindness, of the way she listened without judgment, of the soft strength she carried with her despite the losses she had already endured. They recall the way she was still, after everything, hopeful. It is that hopefulness that makes her story so piercing. The belief that somewhere out there, beyond the limits of her small town, was someone who saw her and cared for her, someone who meant every sweet word he typed. The betrayal of that belief is part of what makes this case so haunting. It is not only about the brutality of the crime, but about the violation of trust at its core. The way a man used the language of affection and understanding to open a door that should have stayed shut between him and a child. Her story sits at the intersection of so many modern realities. The spread of technology into every corner of life, the speed at which friendships form across distance, the difficulty parents face in keeping up with the digital worlds their children inhabit. It is a story about vulnerability and manipulation, but it is also a story about the enduring love of a family and a community that refused to let her fade into a statistic. In Arkansas and beyond, when people tell the story of Casey Woody, they do so with a catch in their throats, with a seriousness that acknowledges both the horror and the responsibility that comes with knowing what happened. They describe how a girl who once fought to walk again became, in death, a catalyst for conversations that may have saved other children from similar fates. Years have passed since the night the rain tapped softly on the windows of the Woody home, while a computer screen glowed in the corner. The internet has grown and shifted, moved from desktop computers in living rooms to smartphones in pockets and smart devices on bedside tables. The platforms are different now. Social media feeds instead of AOL chat rooms, video calls instead of dial-up instant messages. But the core danger that Casey's story revealed remains. Somewhere, someone may be watching, listening, learning how to speak in exactly the way a lonely teenager wants to hear. Yet alongside that danger, there is something else that endures. In the wake of tragedy, people chose to tell her story not as a morbid tale, but as a warning made of love. Parents who might have felt awkward talking to their children about online safety instead found words, often starting with, "There was a girl named Casey." Teachers who struggled to make abstract safety rules feel relevant found that their students listened more closely when they heard about a real girl not much older than they were. In police training rooms and school auditoriums, in community centers and church halls, her name still surfaces. It carries with it the weight of a lost life and the fragile hope that others might be preserved because of it. On certain days, when the sky in Arkansas is a low, gray ceiling and the roads glisten with rain, it is easy to imagine the echo of that night. The sound of the front door, the quiet hum of the computer, the dog barking at something outside. It is tempting in those moments to wish fiercely for a different ending. For a father to come home to nothing more unusual than his daughter asleep on the couch, the screensaver drifting lazily across the monitor, the chat window closed. That ending isn't available. The one that exists is harder, sharper, but it carries within it a kind of plea. It asks us to be braver in our conversations, wiser in our trust, more vigilant in the spaces where the real and the virtual touch. It asks us to remember that behind every case file and news story is a person whose favorite song, whose nervous laugh, whose dreams and fears were as real as our own. Casey Woody's life began with the ordinary hopes of a child in a small town and ended in a way no child's life should. Yet in the stories told about her, in the warnings given in her name, there is an undercurrent of something powerful. The refusal to let her be reduced to the cruelty that ended her days. Instead, she is remembered as a girl who loved and trusted, whose story now travels far beyond the reach of the old chat rooms where she once typed late into the night. In that sense, her voice has not been silenced. It echoes in every parent who pauses before handing over a device, in every teenager who thinks twice about who they can trust online, in every community that chooses to face uncomfortable truths rather than look away. The tension, the sorrow, and the love intertwined in her story reach across the years, asking us not only to mourn, but to learn. And somewhere in that quiet, in the memory of a determined girl walking carefully down a school hallway, lifting one foot and then the other, there is the enduring reminder that even in the darkest stories, the light we carry forward is the way we choose to remember, to protect, and to honor the lives that were taken too soon. Story 5. On a bitter January afternoon in 2005, the sky over East Moline, Illinois, hung low and gray, the kind of sky that made the Mississippi River look like dull metal. In that cold light, a 16-year-old girl named Adrienne Reynolds finished another day of classes at her new school, pulled her coat tight against the wind, and stepped into a life she was only just beginning to build. She had been in Illinois for only a few weeks. Before that, Adrienne had grown up in Texas, a girl with a restless heart and a head full of hopes that didn't always match the reality around her. She wanted more than what she saw in front of her. She talked about travel and independence, about music and friends, and carving out a space in the world that felt like hers. When the opportunity came to move north and live with her father and stepmother, she took it, believing it was a step toward that better future, toward a different kind of life. Illinois, with its harsh winter wind and bare trees, was a shock after the warmth she knew. But for Adrienne, the Quad Cities represented a fresh start, a new school, a new group of friends, and a chance to become the person she imagined when she closed her eyes at night. She enrolled at the Black Hawk College Outreach Center in East Moline, a program that offered high school students a path toward graduation and community college credits. She walked the hallways as the new girl, trying to learn names and faces, building small connections that might grow into real friendships. Among those faces was a girl named Sarah Kolb. Sarah was also 16, but she carried herself with the steady confidence of someone who had already chosen who she wanted to be. She dressed in dark clothes, her hair and makeup carefully styled, her presence commanding in the small social circles that formed quickly among teenagers. People noticed her. She had friends, influence, and a kind of authority within the loose group that shared her music tastes and sense of style. She could be warm and funny, but she could also be sharp. Her approval meant something. Her anger meant even more. Adrienne and Sarah gravitated toward each other at school. At first it was casual. Shared conversations, mutual friends, comments about classes and teachers. But beneath that surface, there was something charged. Some accounts later suggested that Adrienne admired Sarah, maybe even developed romantic feelings. Others said that Sarah herself was drawn to Adrienne, intrigued by the new girl who was eager to fit in. What is clear is that their relationship quickly grew complicated, tangled with jealousy, insecurity, and the intense emotions that can flare among teenagers trying to define themselves. There was another person in that triangle, a 17-year-old boy named Corey Gregory. Corey was quieter than Sarah, more reserved. Where Sarah projected dominance, Corey often followed her lead. He helped her, drove her around, spent time at her side. To some, he seemed devoted, even obedient. He and Adrienne knew each other through school, but the main thread that linked them was Sarah. The three of them formed an uneasy trio that would shift, strain, and finally rupture. As the winter break ended and January progressed, tension simmered beneath the surface. Arguments began, first in person, and then over the glowing screens of their phones and computers. This was 2005, when online platforms and instant messaging were woven into teenage life. Messages could sting as sharply as words spoken face to face. Rumors could spread with a few keystrokes. Hurt feelings could grow in the space of a single evening. Adrienne and Sarah argued about respect, about friendships, about who had said what and to whom. There were accusations of betrayal, of flirting, of crossing lines that should not have been crossed. Some messages were angry, some pleading. There were threats, too careless or serious, hard to parse from a distance but heavy in their effect. What had started as a fragile friendship was hardening into something darker. On January 21st, 2005, the wind whipped through the parking areas outside the Black Hawk Outreach Center as students filtered in and out of the building. For Adrienne, it was just another day at school, until she met up with Sarah and Corey. They had planned to get food together. It sounded simple and harmless, the kind of thing teenagers do without a second thought. The idea of riding in a car with new friends, of sharing a meal, carried no obvious danger on its face. Adrienne climbed into the vehicle with them, unaware that this small decision would be the last truly ordinary act of her life. They drove to a Taco Bell in Moline. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed over the pale tiles, and the smell of fried food hung heavy in the air. The three of them ordered, sat down, and talked. To an outsider, it would have looked like any group of teenagers grabbing lunch. But between the trays and the cups and the casual chatter, the old resentments surfaced again. The disagreements that had built up in messages and whispers did not evaporate under the restaurant's bright lights. After they ate, they left the building and got back into the car. The day was fading toward late afternoon. The river air cut cold through the gaps around the car doors. Instead of returning Adrienne to school or home, Sarah and Corey headed toward a secluded area. A rural spot, out by a park, away from the traffic and prying eyes. What happened next would later be pieced together from statements, physical evidence, and the grim logic of events that followed. In that lonely spot, the simmering anger exploded. Words were exchanged, sharp and heated. Accusations flew. The argument that had begun online, that had festered in glances and muttered comments, broke fully into the open. There was no screen between them now, no buffer. There were only three teenagers in the cold air, their emotions raw, their judgment clouded. At some point, the argument became physical. Sarah attacked Adrienne. Hands around a neck, force applied in panic, rage, or some combination of the two. Whether she intended to kill in that first instant or meant only to frighten and control, the result was the same. Air could not reach Adrienne's lungs. Panic seized her body. Her hands clawed uselessly for release. The struggle left marks, signs that would later be examined in a silent room by strangers. Corey, rather than pulling Sarah away, joined in. He held Adrienne down, assisting in an attack that turned what might have been a momentary assault into something lethal. The world narrowed for Adrienne to the pressure on her throat, the burning in her chest, the sudden dark. And then she was still. In that quiet space, with the winter wind rustling the trees and the sky dimming, the reality of what had happened settled over Sarah and Corey. A living girl, full of plans and frustrations and dreams, was now motionless at their feet. There was no taking back what they had done. No apology, no explanation, no panicked wish could undo it. Their next choices were desperate, cruel, and calculated. Instead of seeking help, instead of calling police or an ambulance, they decided to hide what they had done. Fear of consequences, fear of prison, fear of the word murder attached to their names. Whatever their motivations, they chose to conceal rather than confess. They moved Adrienne's body, transporting her away from the initial scene. Eventually, they ended up in a remote, wooded area near a park on the outskirts of town. The ground there was hard and cold, covered with winter's dead leaves, the trees bare and indifferent. It was a place most people would pass without a second glance. In that isolation, they took their concealment to a horrifying extreme. They dismembered Adrienne's body. This act was not impulsive violence. It required tools, effort, and a chilling willingness to treat a human being as something less than human. Piece by piece, they tried to erase the evidence of her existence, to turn a person into fragments that might never be recognized or found. The violence of the killing was terrible. The desecration that followed added another layer of cruelty that would haunt everyone who later learned the details. They attempted to burn some of the remains, hoping that fire would destroy what knives and saws could not. Flames flickered in the darkness, orange against the black, licking at the evidence, leaving behind charred bone and ash. Smoke drifted up into the cold night air, unnoticed by anyone who might have understood its meaning. When they finished, they concealed what was left as best they could, leaving the woods holding a secret that would not stay buried. Afterward, they tried to resume their lives. They went back to school, back to familiar hallways and familiar faces, carrying inside them the memory of what they had done. They lied to classmates, to teachers, to anyone who asked about Adrienne's whereabouts. They suggested she had run away, that she had taken off on her own, that her absence was voluntary and not a tragedy. They used the ordinary explanation that clings to so many missing teenagers. She just left. At home, however, Adrienne's disappearance was not something that could be brushed aside. She had moved to Illinois to be with her father and stepmother, trusting that this new arrangement would give her structure and closeness she had been missing. When she did not come home, the worry began like a small ripple and quickly became a crashing wave. Her family called friends, called the school, called anyone who might have seen her. They retraced her steps, tried to make sense of her last known movements. Adrienne was resourceful and independent, but she was also young, and it was cold outside. There was no good reason for her to vanish without a word. It wasn't long before law enforcement became involved. A missing teenager is always a cause for concern, but the urgency scales upward when days pass without contact, when there is no activity on bank accounts or phones, when the absence starts to look like something more sinister than teenage rebellion. Investigators began the careful, methodical work that follows every report like this. They interviewed classmates and teachers. They collected statements and tried to identify who had last seen Adrienne and under what circumstances. Names surfaced often: Sarah, Corey. Requests to talk turned into formal interviews. The story of lunch at Taco Bell and an afternoon outing came into focus. At the same time, digital trails began to tell their own story. Messages from before the disappearance showed conflict and animosity. The thread of hostility between Adrienne and Sarah, the grudges that had built up, gave investigators a crucial context. It suggested motive. It highlighted potential suspects. While this was unfolding, the woods near the park, quiet and indifferent, still held what Sarah and Corey had tried to hide. It would take time before that secret was fully revealed, but the distance between crime and discovery was narrowing each day. As the investigation intensified, inconsistencies began to appear in Sarah's and Corey's accounts. Stories changed in small ways. Details conflicted. The kind of cracks that appear when people try to keep track of lies began to spread. Under questioning, the weight of what had happened pressed down on them. Eventually, the truth emerged. Their involvement in Adrienne's death, the assault, the killing, the dismemberment, and the attempts to burn and hide her remains. All of it came into the open, not as rumor or speculation, but as part of a formal criminal case. The quiet, dim woods became a crime scene, filled with officers, tape, and the somber business of documenting what could never be undone. The recovery of Adrienne's remains was a moment of unbearable grief for her family. The hope, however fragile, that she might still be alive was replaced by the brutal reality of her death. The knowledge of what had been done to her added an additional layer of pain that no parent should ever have to carry. They were not allowed the small mercy of imagining a peaceful passing. Instead, they had to live with images of violence and desecration. The legal process that followed was methodical and public. Sarah and Corey were arrested and charged. Because they were teenagers, these charges and the question of how they would be tried, whether as juveniles or adults, became a central issue. The seriousness of what they had done, however, meant that the system would not treat this as a typical juvenile case. The nature of the crime, the deliberate attempts to hide it, and the brutality displayed led prosecutors to pursue adult charges. Courtrooms tend to feel colder than the weather outside. There is an order to them, rows of benches, flags, the elevated bench where the judge sits, the jury box, that stands in stark contrast to the chaos of events that bring people there. In this ordered space, the story of Adrienne's death was retold, piece by piece, through evidence and testimony. Prosecutors outlined the timeline, the tension between Adrienne and Sarah, the plans to meet for lunch, the drive to a secluded area, the attack in the car and outside it, the fatal choking, Corey's decision to assist rather than intervene, and the horrific dismemberment and burning of the body. They brought forward forensic experts to explain what the remains showed, how the injuries were inflicted, what the burning had done and had failed to do. They called witnesses from the school, people who had heard the arguments or seen the interactions between the girls. They presented digital records, messages, posts, statements that revealed the growing hostility leading up to that January day. They painted a picture of a conflict that had been allowed to escalate unchecked until it erupted into lethal violence. Defense attorneys, bound to represent their clients, tried to present a different angle. They raised questions about intent, about who had initiated the attack, about influence and pressure. They pointed out that these were teenagers, not seasoned adults, arguing that immaturity and emotional volatility had played a role. They suggested that panic and fear had shaped the decisions that followed, that the dismemberment and attempts to hide the body were driven by terror more than calculation. But the core facts remained. Adrienne had gone to lunch with two peers and never returned. She had been killed, her body demeaned in death, her remains hidden in a way that suggested not a single moment of loss of control, but a series of disturbing, sustained decisions. In this process, Adrienne was no longer able to speak for herself. The only voice she had came from the people who knew her, who loved her, and who had to stand in that courtroom and try to convey who she had been before her life became a case file. They talked about a girl who wanted a fresh start, who had taken a chance on a new life in a new state. They talked about her humor, her struggles, her hopes. They tried to turn her from a victim number back into a daughter, a friend, a person. After hearing the evidence, the jurors had to decide. Their verdicts were clear. Both Sarah and Corey were found guilty for their roles in Adrienne's death. The precise charges and legal language might have differed, but the substance was the same. The law recognized what had happened as a serious crime, one that warranted long terms of imprisonment. Sentencing hearings are often quieter than trials, but they carry their own heavy weight. It is in those moments that the court balances the harm done, the responsibility of the offenders, and the need to protect the community. Victim impact statements allowed Adrienne's family to speak directly to the court, describing their loss and the emptiness left behind. They spoke of birthdays that would never be celebrated, milestones that would never be reached, an entire future erased in one afternoon. The sentences imposed reflected the gravity of the crime. Sarah and Corey, both teenagers at the time of the killing, faced decades behind bars. In legal terms, the punishment was meant to acknowledge the brutality of what they had done and to send a message about the seriousness with which society views such acts. But no sentence, no matter how long, could restore what was lost. For Adrienne's family, the aftermath of the trial did not bring closure in any easy or complete sense. They might have received a measure of justice, but justice is not the same as healing. Grief settled into the rhythms of their daily lives. It appeared in unexpected moments, in a favorite song, in a photograph, in the sight of other teenagers laughing together outside a school. Every reminder of what 16 looks like became, for them, a reminder of what was taken. For the community, the case served as a sudden, painful crack in the illusion that such violence only happens elsewhere. Parents looked differently at their children's friendships, at their online interactions, at the undercurrents of anger and jealousy that can be so intense during adolescence. Teachers and school officials had to confront the possibility that a student who sits in their classroom today may not be there tomorrow for reasons that go far beyond ordinary teenage risk. The story of Adrienne's murder also raised hard questions about the emotional lives of young people and the ways ordinary conflicts can amplify into something deadly when mixed with insecurity, pride, and poor judgment. The argument between Adrienne and Sarah began as so many teenage conflicts do. Disagreements over words, over who said what to whom, over loyalty and betrayal in social circles that can feel like entire worlds at that age. Yet it did not stay there. It crossed a line from emotional harm into physical violence, and from physical violence into an act that ended a life. There is, in this, a painful lesson about the fragility of human life when anger is not checked, when empathy fails, and when the moment to walk away is ignored. Adrienne's story is not just about her death. It is about her decision to seek a new life, about the courage it takes for a teenager to start over in a new place, about the way she tried to fit in and build friendships in unfamiliar halls. It is about her laughter and her quirks, the small details that those who loved her remember, even if the world at large knows her name mainly in connection with tragedy. It is also about the two teenagers who, in a span of hours, crossed a line that would define the rest of their lives. They were not faceless monsters. They were young people, capable of kindness in some moments and terrible cruelty in others. That complexity does not lessen their responsibility, nor does it soften the horror of what they did. But it reminds us that the seeds of violence can take root in ordinary lives when compassion erodes and anger becomes a weapon. Yet, beneath all the analysis and commentary, there remains something simple and devastating. A 16-year-old girl with a future ahead of her went to lunch with two classmates and never came home. On that January day, the sky dimmed as evening came on. The river moved steadily past the city, indifferent to the human drama unfolding in its shadow. Life in the Quad Cities continued. People went to work, cooked dinner, watched television. The world did not stop when Adrienne's life ended. But for those who knew her, and for those who have come to know her story, There is a sense that something should pause in recognition of what was lost. A moment of silence, a breath taken with more care than usual, an acknowledgement of how fragile and precious it is simply to walk out of a school building and make it safely home. In remembering Adrienne, the goal is not to dwell on the gruesome details of her death, but to honor the person she was and the life she was trying to build. It is to understand, as fully as we can, the chain of choices and emotions that led to that winter afternoon, not to excuse them, but to learn from them. It is to feel, even briefly, the weight of the grief carried by those who loved her, and to allow that feeling to deepen our own commitment to empathy and restraint in our daily lives. Her story is one of bright potential cut short, of trust betrayed, of ordinary anger turned deadly. It is also a reminder that every teenager navigating the difficult terrain of friendships, identity, and conflict is someone's child, someone's whole world, and deserves to be treated with care. On that cold day in January, when Adrienne walked out of school and into the car with Sarah and Corey, she could not have known that she was stepping into the last hours of her life. She could not have imagined that her name would one day be spoken in courtrooms and news reports, that strangers would struggle to say it without feeling a catch in their throats. She knew only that she was 16, new to town, still finding her way. She wanted what so many young people want: connection, acceptance, a path forward. That simple, universal desire is what makes her story so deeply painful. It is also what makes her memory worth holding on to, not as a cautionary tale alone, but as a reminder of how important it is to protect the vulnerable, to cool our anger before it hardens into something deadly, and to cherish, fiercely, the lives that pass through our hands every day. Story 6. The night of April 19th, 1997, began with the familiar, electric thrum of a Saturday in Algete, a quiet satellite town nestled in the rolling hills north of Madrid. For 16-year-old Eva Blanco Puig, the night was a constellation of simple teenage joys: laughter with friends, the pulsating beat of music at the Genesis nightclub, and the feeling of being on the cusp of everything. Eva was a bright, responsible student with a warm smile, known for her cheerful disposition and her close-knit group of friends. She was the kind of girl who always called her parents, who never missed her curfew. As she and her friends left the club just before midnight, the cool spring air was filled with promises of a Sunday to come, of a life stretching out before them, uncomplicated and full of light. Eva parted ways with her best friend at a roundabout, a familiar intersection in their hometown. It was a short walk to her house, a journey she had made countless times. Her curfew was 1 a.m., and she was on track to make it. But as the minutes ticked by and the clock struck 1, a quiet unease began to settle over the Blanco household. Eva, the girl who was never late, did not come home. Her parents, Manuel and Olga, began the frantic ritual known to every parent whose child is missing. Calling friends, pacing the floor, their worry slowly curdling into a cold, hard knot of fear. As the hours stretched into the bleak light of dawn, that fear became a certainty. Something was terribly wrong. The search began immediately, a frantic combing of the town by family, friends, and the local civil guard. The hope was for a simple, teenage explanation, a missed connection, a miscommunication. But that hope was brutally extinguished on the morning of Monday, April 20th. In a desolate, overgrown area near a local road, a grim discovery was made. Lying in the tall grass, partially concealed from view, was the body of Eva Blanco. The scene was a tableau of unimaginable violence. Eva had been stabbed at least 20 times in her back and neck with a small, sharp blade, likely a knife or a box cutter. The attack was savage, a frenzy of rage that left no doubt as to the killer's intent. An autopsy would later reveal that she had also been sexually assaulted. The cause of death was exsanguination. She had bled to death in the cold, dark field. The police investigation, codenamed Operation Pandilla, Operation Gang, began with a horrifying crime scene and a community plunged into a state of shock and terror. The initial investigation focused on Eva's inner circle, a standard procedure in any homicide case. Detectives meticulously interviewed her friends, classmates, and any known boyfriends, searching for a secret, a grudge, a hidden conflict that could explain such brutality. The prevailing theory was that the killer was someone she knew, perhaps a secret boyfriend or a spurned admirer. But her friends and family insisted she had no such secrets. She was an open book, a girl whose life was as wholesome as it appeared. The investigation hit a wall. There were no witnesses, no obvious suspects, and the murder weapon was never found. There was, however, one crucial piece of evidence recovered from Eva's body, a DNA sample from her killer. In 1997, DNA technology was still in its relative infancy. It was a powerful tool, but it was only as good as the database it could be compared against. The killer's genetic fingerprint was a key without a lock. For years, it would remain the silent, central clue in a case that was rapidly growing cold. As months turned into years, the investigation became a sprawling, frustrating epic. Over 30 different officers would eventually work the case. They cast a wide net, investigating more than 1,500 people. They took voluntary DNA samples from over 200 men in Algiers and the surrounding towns, hoping for a random match that would break the case open. Every sample came back negative. They sought help from international law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, sharing details of the crime in the hope that a similar attack had occurred elsewhere. Every lead was a dead end. The killer of Eva Blanco was a ghost, a phantom who had struck with vicious fury and then vanished without a trace. For Eva's parents, the years were a slow, grinding torture. They refused to let their daughter's memory fade, becoming relentless advocates for justice. They appeared on television, gave interviews, and worked tirelessly to keep the case in the public consciousness. Their grief was a constant, public reminder that a monster was walking free. Their town, once a symbol of suburban safety, was now forever marked by the shadow of an unsolved murder. The first significant flicker of movement in the case didn't come until 2007, a full decade after the murder. A specialist at the University of Santiago de Compostela re-examined the DNA evidence with more advanced techniques. The analysis yielded a groundbreaking new piece of information. The killer was not of European descent. He was a man of North African origin. This revelation dramatically narrowed the focus of the investigation, but it also presented a new set of challenges. It confirmed that the killer was likely not from Eva's immediate social circle, lending credence to the theory of a stalker or a predator who was unknown to her. Even with this new information, the case stalled again. The DNA profile remained a key without a lock. Then in 2013, another leap in forensic science provided a new path forward. Genealogical DNA analysis, a technique that allows investigators to identify suspects through their family members, was becoming a viable tool. The Civil Guard, armed with this new capability, decided to launch an audacious and unprecedented strategy. They would attempt to build a family tree for their phantom killer by systematically testing men of North African origin who had lived in the Algiers community around the time of the murder. It was a monumental task, a genetic needle in a haystack. They began by meticulously cross-referencing census data, residency permits, and other records to identify every man who fit the profile and had a connection to Algiers in 1997. They then began the slow, painstaking process of approaching these men and asking for their help, for a voluntary DNA sample that could help them find a killer who had haunted their community for 16 years. Hundreds of men agreed to cooperate, a testament to the deep scars the crime had left on the town. For 2 years, the DNA samples poured in. Each one was tested against the crime scene evidence, and each one came back as a non-match. The frustration mounted. Then, in the summer of 2015, they got the break they had been waiting for. A DNA sample from one of the volunteers came back not as a direct match, but as a close familial match. The man was not the killer, but he was related to him. He was a sibling. After 18 years of dead ends, the Civil Guard finally had a name. The volunteer's brother was a Moroccan Spanish citizen named Ahmed Cheljurj. He had lived in Algiers with his brother in 1997, just a stone's throw from Eva's home. He had a criminal record, though not for violent crime. And crucially, he had left Spain years ago and was now living in the town of Pierrefonds, France. The ghost finally had a face. Working with French authorities, the civil guard began a covert surveillance operation on Ahmed. They followed him, watched him, waiting for an opportunity to obtain a discarded DNA sample to confirm their suspicion. They retrieved a used water bottle he had thrown away. The DNA sample from the bottle was rushed to a lab for analysis. It was a perfect match to the DNA found on Eva Blanco's body 18 years earlier. On October 1st, 2015, French police, acting on an international warrant, arrested Ahmed Chelgerge. The news sent a shockwave through Spain. The quiet, cold case that had haunted a generation was suddenly, explosively solved. For Eva's parents, the arrest was a moment of profound, earth-shattering relief. "We have never lost hope," her father Manuel told the press, his voice thick with an emotion that had been building for nearly 2 decades. Ahmed was extradited to Spain to face justice. During his interrogation, he denied everything. He claimed he had never seen Eva Blanco, that he had no memory of the night of the murder. But the DNA evidence was irrefutable. As he awaited trial, the country prepared for a legal proceeding that would finally close the book on one of its most infamous crimes. But the case of Eva Blanco had one final, tragic twist. On January 29, 2016, just 4 months after his arrest, Ahmed Chelgerge was found dead in his prison cell. He had committed suicide, hanging himself with the cord from his sweatpants. He had taken his own life before a court could pass judgment on him, taking the full story of what happened on that April night in 1997 to his grave. For the Blanco family, the suicide was a final, cruel theft. They had been robbed of the chance to see their daughter's killer face them in court, to hear the evidence laid bare, to have the public record state, unequivocally, his guilt. The legal case was officially closed, the suspect dead. But the resolution was a hollow one. Justice had been found, but it had not truly been served. The story of Eva Blanco stands as a remarkable testament to the power of forensic science and the tenacity of law enforcement. A cold case solved by a combination of new technology and old-fashioned police work. But it is also a somber reminder that even when a mystery is solved, the pain of the victims can never be erased, and some questions, buried in the heart of a killer, can never be answered.